Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We will be starting in just a moment as everyone gets let into the Zoom. Wonderful. Now, I would like to begin today's session by saying that I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners and original custodians of this land and pay my respects to the elders past and present and the elders from other communities who may be here today. So welcome to our online open studio with Lyn Guy. Thank you so much for everyone for your patience in the waiting room. I hope everyone had a comfy couch and a cup of tea. Very excited to introduce Lyn to you today. This is a part of our Craft Contemporary 2021 offering with Boroondara Arts. And we're very excited to talk through Lyn's textile art practice and Lyn's art journey. So I will hand over to Lyn. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to pop them in the chat. Leave yourself on mute throughout and Lyn will make opportunities for questions where you can either unmute or I can voice your question for you if you pop it in the chat. Over to Lyn.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for all of that, but the hiccups were at my end. Well, thank you for letting me share my work with you, to be able to present textile art, which is perhaps not extensively seen in the community, is just a great opportunity. I'll try and share, we've got a shorter bit of time today, but try and share my bit of my journey from where I started to where I am today. So perhaps if you can just move to the next slide and go through to the following one. And another one. Just a little bit of, oh no, back one. Just a little bit of background on, for your information. After a 40+ year career in education, both in teaching and administration, I retired at the end of 2000. I'd always sewn, but when you work full time, you've not got much time for the creative opportunities. So it was, I did a lot of sewing, but practical things. If you could move to the next one. On my to-do list in retirement, top of the list was to find out what I could do with all those dozen or so feet that came with a new machine I'd bought a couple of years earlier. So I joined a local sewing club, and it was there I was introduced to free machine embroidery. And that was something that I took a lot of interest in. And I did a lot of workshops with a tutor just to enhance that skill. I did that for a couple of years over 2001, 2002. And the tutor of the workshops happened to be a tutor at a visual arts course that majored in stitch and textiles. And it was at her suggestion that I then joined the visual arts course in 2003. So if you can move that on, please. This course was a 3-year course. Unfortunately, the contact hours were not overly, weren't too time consuming, and so it didn't take up a lot of my time, but the practical side did, and that I could do that in my own time. So I graduated from that in 2005. So if you could move on. One of the things that I find greatly important in my work is my journal work. I create a journal for every single piece of work that I do. I create a journal whereby I do sketches, trials, images. These are just some of the, I don't know if you can see them. It's a bit hard to just trials in my journal on some, and you can see from there some of the work that I've done in my journal. So failures, successes. But after graduating, so the next slide, please. After graduating, I think in the course we were exposed to just about everything you could do with textiles. So you had to really identify what it was that you wanted to do. So I really wanted to focus on my free machine embroidery, but I also enjoyed silk painting and silk dyeing. So that was where I then focused my work. But the free machine embroidery was probably the biggest influence that I carried through. So after graduating, this was my first piece that I completed after I graduated. And I think I worked in small pieces. These tile size pieces were probably about 12 centimetres by 12. I dyed the fabrics in this piece, but if you can see, you can see the free machine embroidery tended to be my main focus, but also using the skill of my dyeing. And the next piece of work too, if you can go to the next slide, was a similar piece. I think the smaller pieces of work helped me to perhaps use my machine more easily than having a large piece of work. And these I put onto foam tile backings and just created the images. But these were pretty well all free machine embroidery. If you move on, that's just another close-up of that piece. And you can see I just did random stitching behind the image, and then it was more painting with my machine, just as an artist would paint with a brush. I was using my machine to do that. The next piece, I use my photos. My camera is a big part of my process, and I use my photos. And in this instance, at this stage, I actually took a rose from bud form and I photographed it every day for 7 days. And I selected 5 of those images. And at this stage, I was still focusing more on free machine embroidery. If you can go through the next few slides, you'll see how I picked 5 images and I just took through the 5 images and from the opening from the bud to the full bloom. And again, the free machine embroidery was the focus. And the next slide there was just, the next following one is just another one that I did. Again, that was done on silk organza. And I just used a few different skills there, but predominantly all of those pieces I sold in an exhibition. Again, travel was an important part of my life, and I was taking a lot of photographs. So if you could move on, this is perhaps where I was began the influence of using my tiny pieces of silk. I was in Barcelona and I'd visited a lot of Gaudi's buildings, and because I was working in small tile-sized pieces, and a lot of his work is all tiles broken up, I just felt that maybe that was something I could, move on with. And if you move to the next slide, this was perhaps my first piece in starting to use tiny pieces of silk, but again, adhering to my interest in free machine embroidery. Here I was using purchased silks, so I had to just seek out colours that I could find. If you move on further and go through the next group of slides, these were all pieces of work from my interest in the Gaudi work. And you can see I still had my focus in my free machine embroidery, but then I was starting to mix it up. So I think my next slide is a new direction. No, following that. Oh, this particular piece, this I created for a religious exhibition. And this one now is in the Bible Society boardroom in Sydney. The next slide. And this is where I went on a new direction. I had started working with the tiny pieces of silk, and I thought, can I move into creating landscapes? So this was in 2010, I'd been travelling a lot through Spain, and again, using my photos. Most of these images were courtyard scenes from the Alhambra Palace in Granada and through some palaces in Cordoba and Seville. So some of these images were part of my first exhibition at the gallery, and they were all courtyard scenes from areas in Spain. If you can move through just the next few slides, you can probably see here that I had a little bit of a gap in some of those first ones, and my new ones you'll find are quite different. But here I wasn't focusing on my free machine embroidery as much. I was creating the image with my tiny pieces of silk. The pieces of silk are about the size of my fingernail. This particular one has a lot of free machine embroidery, so I hadn't quite moved away from it. And if you can keep going. This particular one was probably where I took my next step. There's a lot of free machine embroidery in this one, but I was using purchased silks, but I needed about 6 or 7 different shades of grey, and I couldn't buy them. So I knew how to dye my silk, so I decided I would dye my silk for this one. And so that was probably where I then ventured into the next step. So if you could move on through those, these were just snippets or windows from those pieces. My next, I always had a theme in my work, and the last theme had been Spain, and this time I went from a trip to Venice, and this was another exhibition I had at the gallery in 2017. And because I had dyed my silks for that particular piece that I mentioned, the colours in Venice was quite unusual. And so I decided I would dye all my fabrics. So that was where I then moved to dyeing all my own fabrics. Now, the next pieces, they are just pieces from the exhibition. Again, my free machine embroidery now is just highlighting things, but also I free machine totally over the whole piece, and that gives it the textured appearance, the knitted appearance. So if you go through those next few slides, they're just some images of the pieces that I had in that exhibition.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Lyn, you've just seemed to be popped on mute. Can you just unmute yourself, Lyn? There we go.
Right, okay. If you just finish these are just the images of some of the pieces I had in that exhibition. Now then, that stopped there. I had done 2 series on overseas. I'd done Spain and Venice. I travelled a lot in the motorhome extensively throughout Australia, and the colours in our Australian outback are just amazing. And so I decided my next thing would be the Australian outback. And because I can dye my own silks, I then can get those wonderful colours. Now, there are a few images just of my current works on the Australian outback. That's just a close-up. Whether you can see how tiny the pieces of silk are. And again, my free machine embroidery is the overall work, plus just some outline. In this particular one, you can see where I've done all the tiny pieces of silk, but then to create the wire fence, I've used my free machine embroidery. So where I can use it, I do. If you can move through those. And just these couple that are. Right, now my current works. I wanted to start on something new, and so I decided, again, using my photographs, to do a series on coastal images. So I'll try and take you now through. Now I'm a little bit limited because we had a few problems. My actual process, so you'll have to excuse me while I go and get up a few things. If the PowerPoint goes off now, and I can then maybe use, can the screen be used for my images? My very first start is I use a fabric which is called Shapewell. It's a really stiff interfacing material, and under the machine I can stitch without having to have an embroidery hoop. To start, I use a photograph of my image that I've chosen. I might have cropped it, and I just do a very brief, simple pencil outline of the main parts of the image. This is perhaps for my next piece, and it's an image of the tessellated pavement in Tasmania. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. my next step is my frame for my silk dyeing. I set this frame up so I was hoping I could use my iPad to move around, but it's just, I don't need big quantities of silk. So I use my frame, set my silk up, and I have an image here of perhaps my colours, and you can see the image of the frame. I divide it with Gouta into narrow strips and then just paint my dyes. My dyes, I use Procyon dyes. I don't know if you're familiar with them. I use Procyon dyes. They're quite potent, so you do need a mask when you're using the powder. And that is mixed with a paint powder, a solution, and I mix up and I have my dyes in little containers. And then I just use it's actually a calligraphy brush I use to paint my silk. Once the silk's painted, it needs 24 hours to dry. Procyon dyes, as a matter of fact, these Procyon dyes, they're only used on natural fibres, not on acrylic fibres. Once my dyes are dry, I heat set them, and I iron on an adhesive fabric. I use Lysifix, and Lysifix has an adhesive on the back, and I iron that onto my silk panel. Then I take the Lysifix off, and on the back, if I can get the light on it, it's got an adhesive on it. So that then enables me to use my tiny little iron and my tweezers. So it's quite time consuming. I use my tiny little iron and my tweezers to apply the tiny pieces of silk to create my image. And as I said, a lot of the pieces of silk are about the size of my fingernail. So my tiny little iron, this is actually called a clover iron. It's lovely and lightweight, which makes it very easy to use. And it has about 2 or 3 different heads. And I think they actually use it in doll making, you know, things for, and getting up inside to flatten seams and things. But it's ideal for what I do. Yes, so it's a bit difficult, but I will try and, with my dyes, this is a piece of work that I'm working on at the moment. It's an image of at Bicheno in Tasmania. Once I've done my silks, this is actually one of my journals. I take samples and I keep a sample of all the silks that I've created. You can see my rack there. And I take a note of what I use to create them. How many teaspoons or how many drops of a colour and how much paint stock solution I've used. And so that then means if I want to create the colour again, I can come back to my records and achieve what it is that I want. And this is actually the piece that I am working on at the moment. You can see it's the shape well. You can see on the bottom there my simple sketch, and then I just use my tiny pieces of silk to create the image. So that's the one that I'm working on at the moment. This one is a completed work, and this was of a photo when I was in Norfolk Island. Now, to complete my work, once I have finished laying down all my pieces to create the image, I then use Pelham, which is just a fine wadding. And so I have my work, I put the wadding behind it, and then I also use, this is it's a perforated fabric, but it gives it a lot of strength at the back. And so I have the 3 layers, or 4 layers really. I have the shape well, I have my silk pieces, I put the Pelham behind, and then I use this, and that makes it really strong, and I can just free machine completely over the whole image. So once I've done that, it needs just a good press to flatten it out. And these are some of my images. As I said, this is the image of Norfolk Island over Slaughter Bay. This is another image that I've created. Now these, once they're finished, you can see all the layers here. I don't know if you can see them. You can see all the layers. But once I've pressed them, just to keep them ready for framing, I stitch them onto mount board. I must use an acid-free natural fibre, so I use a very heavy cotton twine to stitch it onto the mount board, and that then I can just file away, ready for framing for when I'm ready to exhibit. I was hoping I'd be able to just take my iPad to show you these, but this is one from Tasmania. Again, this is a part of my coastal series. And on these, I have very little machine embroidery other than totally over the whole piece to give it its texture. And this one here is also another one. It's from Arthur River. It's called The Edge of the World, and it's the furthest point on the coastline. I hope I've been able to give you some sort of insight into how my pieces are created. So I don't know whether you've got any questions or whether it's been of interest to you. Perhaps if you have got any questions that you might like to ask, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Lyn. Yes, if there are any questions, feel free to unmute or raise your hand or pop something in the chat. And I'll just do a little browse through everyone to see. This has been a lovely chat, Lyn. Thank you so much for showing us through your studio space and letting us see those works up close to the camera. It's been really lovely.
Oh, well, it's a little bit difficult. I was hoping I could just take the iPad around my room, which would have made it easy. But anyway, it didn't work out that way.
Now, you've got some works that people can have a look at on our website at the moment, which I'll actually pop a link in the chat. Your Outback exhibition, if anyone would like to have a little browse of Lyn's works online, those are available to see there. I might ask personally, Lyn, did you dye those fabrics yourself as well for the works in Outback?
Yes, all of those I've dyed myself. You just can't purchase the colours that you need for the Australian Outback colours. So if I need 20 shades of oranges and reds, I can get them. I start off with the most solid colour that I want, and then I just dilute by adding my paint stock solution to the dye, which then, you know, if I add a teaspoon to it and then I add another teaspoon, it just gives me the exact tint, but gives me the shade. So I can get 20 shades of a colour if I need it. So, and then I found that's been far better than trying to buy fabric. And also I only need little pieces of it. So I start off with a cream silk, not a white silk. I start off with a cream silk and then dye that.
Where were you traveling to get the images for those works?
We initially travelled from, we went up to the Gold Coast and then we went inland. We went inland through Roma, through Charleville, and then up to Longreach, up to Mount Isa, to Cloncurry. Then we went across the tablelands, the Barclay tablelands, went up to Darwin, and some of the pieces there are at Mataranka, where the thermal pools are, and very interesting place, and Catherine. And then we came down the Stuart Highway and through Coobapedy, so that's where the Moon Plain pieces are. That's where the Mad Max films and Priscilla of the Desert were done. And through that, you know, it's such a fascinating place. And then through the West Macdonald Ranges. So a lot of those pieces are through Stanley Chasm, through the Ochre Pits, and they're all through the West Macdonald Ranges out of Alice Springs. So that's predominantly, you know, one of where I got most of the images for this series.
Beautiful. I've got a question amongst many thank yous in the chat. Sally was wondering where you did the textile course.
I did it at Box Hill at the Whitehorse campus, and I think it continued for probably another 3 years or 4 years after I did it. But then they combined it with the fashion course. So I don't think the course is actually, as it was, is available today, but it was called Visual Arts, Diploma of Visual Arts, Studio Stitch and Textiles. So it was just ideal for me.
Wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you so much and give everyone one final minute for any last minute questions in the chat. But this has been a wonderful talk, Lyn, and it's been so lovely to see your works and learn about your travels and inspiration. I'm going to share my screen one final time and say thank you to everyone for coming along today. We've got a few more craft contemporary offerings coming up. We've got a panel talk this Saturday moderated by Sai Wai Fu, featuring Aaron Billings, Tantri Mystica and Shania Mapotza Russell. And we have 2 workshops that you can book in at the moment via the Boroondara Arts website. The link is just on that slide. We've got Mon Mungan healing bracelets with Cassie Leatham on Friday the 22nd and a visible mending workshop on Wednesday the 27th coming up. It's been a real pleasure to have you, Lyn. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your patience today and our apologies for the delayed start.
Thank you. Been great to be able to share with you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lyn.
Thank you.